Ken Lee, Tech Lead for NetApp IT Storage Team. Today, in this short video, I will explain how to attach an ONTAP FlexVol into a container running in a Kubernetes environment. What I will cover is the Kubernetes configuration files that is needed to create the relationship between an ONTAP FlexVol and a Kubernetes pod. To do that, we'll need three Kubernetes objects defined using config file. They are persistent volume claim, and a pod. Starting with a persistent volume config file, which defines the connection between Kubernetes and an ONTAP SVM. This first section is the standard definition for a persistent volume. We use the spec section to define the size of the ONTAP volume and the access mode used by Kubernetes. This next section is the NFS section. This section is where you tell Kubernetes where to find the physical FlexVol. The server parameter is used to specify ONTAP SVM data lift. The path statement is the name of the junction path defined for the FlexVol. Note that nowhere is the FlexVol volume name reference. The export policy for the volume should be exported to the subnet range used by the Kubernetes cluster. The next object in the relationship is the pod. This section is the standard data for a pod, and you will need to define which namespace you want the pod to run in. The spec section is where we define the volume, container, and the volume mount point to be used in the pod. The volume section is where you make up a name for the volume to be used within the pod. In this example, I have chosen my volume 01. To reference the backend physical volume, you use the claim name parameter, which is needed to match the persistent volume claim name that you will create later or have already created. The container section is where you define the mount information. Note that the name parameter in the volume mount section refers to the name parameter in the volume section. Nowhere is the FlexVol name or the junction path reference. The last object is the persistent volume claim. This object ties the persistent volume object and the pod object together to access ONTAP storage. This section is the standard for the persistent volume claim. A persistent volume claim must be in the same namespace as that of the pod that will be using this persistent volume claim. The name is the name used by the claim name defined in the pod config file at the volume spec section. The spec section should match that of the persistent volume. There you have it, a quick, simple relationship diagram between Kubernetes and ONTAP FlexVol.